The U.S. is reportedly gearing up to bring charges against another world leader. Sources tell MS Now the Justice Department is expected to announce an indictment today against Raul Castro, the former Cuban president and brother of Fidel Castro. That announcement expected at a press conference in Miami this afternoon. And we are told the charges would relate to the Cuban government's downing of planes run by a humanitarian rescue group back in 1996. The Trump administration has significantly ratcheted up pressure on Cuba in recent months on top of more than 6 decades of U.S. sanctions on Havana. And now the administration could be seeking to run the same playbook the administration used in Venezuela. As the New York Times puts it, it cannot be lost on anyone in the Cuban government that the Trump administration used a federal indictment against Nicolás Maduro, the authoritarian leader of Venezuela, as the pretext for a raid to swoop into Caracas in January and seize him. Let's bring in journalist and MS Now contributor Paula Ramos. Paula, there have been these escalating tensions between the Trump administration and Cuba for months. Why would the DOJ indict Raul Castro now, especially for something that happened 30 years ago?
It's the same thing that happened with Nicolás Maduro. You're essentially seeing the Trump administration fabricating a story, fabricating the pretext to eventually perhaps have some type of intervention. More than anything, this is supposed to exploit a type of psychological terror inside the island so that someone like Raul Castro feels like a fugitive. The question is, Ana, will that work? But here's the thing. I think Donald Trump needs a good story right now. He's seeing his polls completely plummeting. Iran is a disaster. He's even losing touch with the Latino community. The problem is that this is not Venezuela 2.0. Now, there's a lot of different factors happening inside the island. For one, if there is a military intervention, the Cuban Revolutionary Armed Forces, Ana, will revolt, right? This is an institution that very much was built around anti-imperialism. Now, this is an institution that Fidel Castro would say, homeland or death, patria o muerte. And so that can happen. There's also no Delcy Rodriguez. And there's also no military shadow operation that is disloyal to Raul Castro. And so I think this story, that Donald Trump wants, which is essentially to be the one president that did what no one else could do since John F. Kennedy, that can actually turn into a nightmare. And the people that will really suffer are Cubans.
I want to play some of what we have heard recently from the president related to Cuba. Let's listen.
Cuba's next, by the way, but pretend I didn't say that, please. Pretend I didn't say that. Please, please, please.
Is Cuba next?
Well, it depends on what your definition of military action is. I've been hearing about Cuba since I'm a little boy. They've been saying, what's going on with Cuba? And I think we'll be turning it. They're taking the aid. They want aid. They need help.
Look, Cuba's calling us. They need help. I am very prone toward the Cuban Americans. They have family members in Cuba. They've been treated very, very badly. They've been treated extremely badly. And we're going to get that solved. That's not going to be hard for us to solve.
Well, clearly the president thinks focusing on Cuba could bring him a political win. What do you think?
No, I mean, it's so disappointing, that someone can speak of countries as if they were their property. And the biggest tragedy of all of this, Ana, is that the Cuban people in this island that has such a long history of colonialism and interventions, and they're kind of stuck between these two impossible scenarios. On the one hand, they're facing this brutal totalitarian regime on the island, and on the other hand, they're facing, of course, these imperialistic tendencies of the Trump administration. And they themselves, for decades, have not been able to choose their freedom, not to choose their liberty. No one has ever asked the Cuban people on the island for the last 50 years, what type of government do you want? Do you want simply a one-party system? Do you want democracy? And who do you want to be led by? And that is the biggest tragedy, to hear the president of the United States that is positioning himself as this sort of empire of liberty, to hear him talk about these countries. And the same way I have to say that he talks about women is a disgrace.
Today is Cuban Independence Day. Right? How does this rhetoric and these potential moves, if we see an indictment, for example, come today, how is that received by the Cuban exile community?
My grandfather, Ana, he was a political prisoner under Fidel Castro. He started with the revolution and eventually became a journalist and was imprisoned for almost a year, and he escaped. And so I think of him today, and because I think a lot of Cuban exiles that are facing this possible indictment have a lot of mixed emotions. And I understand that. Now, the possibility that somehow maybe you're closer to going back home, and that is very emotional. What saddens me, though, is that emotion is literally based on an illusion right now. It's based on a delusion. Because at the same time, what we're seeing is, unfortunately, the repetition of history. To your point, it is Cubans' Independence Day. Like I've said, it's an island that has been overshadowed by interventions. And I find it very hard to believe that this was the way that my grandfather would have loved to go back to his island. No, not by a Donald Trump that is more interested in power and is more interested in money than he is in the actual Cuban people.
What can you tell us about what people on the island are experiencing right now? What are conditions like right now?
You know, it's been an ongoing humanitarian crisis for decades. And obviously that is now exacerbated by the cruelty of this administration. People are hungry. People are starving. There's no food. There's no electricity. And you go into the hospitals, mothers and children are literally facing life and death situations. At the same time, it's important to know, on a day like today, May 20th, you have independent journalists, for example, like Joanny Sanchez, who's been this amazing journalist on the island that as we speak right now, and she's being surveilled by the Cuban government. So you have journalists like her, activists, political dissidents that at the same time are facing and have been facing this repression. And so Cubans have been stuck in this perfect storm that is about to burst. And that's what scares me. Then there's the question of, and where do they go? Obviously, there's been a mass exodus of Cubans that have gone towards the United States. And at the same time, in the United States, Donald Trump is deporting Cubans at higher rates than any other president. He is repatriating Cubans back to the island at higher rates than his three predecessors. And so it's literally being stuck in these impossible scenarios.
Paola Ramos, thank you for shining light. It's always nice to have you with us.